A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the ancient cliffs of Meridian Cove, casting eerie shadows through the stained glass windows of St. Lysander's Cathedral. On this stormy evening, no one could have predicted how a single act of defiance would shake the foundations of faith and reason alike. When technology mogul Cyprian Thorne stormed into evening mass to challenge God himself, what happened next would leave the entire town questioning everything they believed about science, faith, and the thin line between the possible and impossible. This is a story that will challenge your beliefs and make you question the very nature of reality. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss our most shocking true stories. The salt-laden wind whipped through the narrow streets of Meridian Cove, carrying with it centuries of whispered prayers and untold secrets. Perched precariously on the edge of towering granite cliffs, the town seemed to exist in a world of its own, where the boundary between earth and sky blurred in the ever-present coastal mist. The imposing silhouette of St. Lysander's Cathedral rose above the town like a sentinel, its weathered stone walls having withstood countless storms and seasons. Tonight, however, something different hung in the air. The usual evening fog had taken on an unusual golden hue, and the lighthouse beam cutting through the darkness seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. The townspeople, accustomed to the whims of coastal weather, felt an inexplicable tension in their bones as they made their way to evening mass. Inside his clifftop mansion, Cyprian Thorne stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, his sharp features reflected in the rain-streaked glass. At 45, he had built an empire on quantum computing breakthroughs that had revolutionized artificial intelligence. His algorithms had made him billions, but they had also convinced him of something else: the mathematical impossibility of divine intervention. Sipes' fingers traced the edges of an old photograph, its corners worn from years of handling. The image showed a young boy in a hospital bed, machines beeping ineffectively as life slipped away. 20 years, he whispered to the empty room. 20 years of prayers that went unanswered. His jaw tightened as he watched the faithful trudging through the rain toward the cathedral. The town's ancient bell tower began its sonorous call to mass, each toll seeming to challenge Sip's carefully constructed worldview. He had not come to Meridian Cove by chance. After months of research, he had chosen this specific church, this specific town, for what he was about to do. St. Lysander's Cathedral had a reputation for inexplicable events, for moments that defied scientific explanation. Tonight, he would expose it all as elaborate fiction. As Sip drove his sleek electric vehicle through the winding streets, the town's unusual character revealed itself. Unlike other coastal communities that had modernized to attract tourists, Meridian Cove seemed frozen in time. Gas lamps cast pools of flickering light on cobblestone streets, and ancient symbols were carved into the cornerstones of buildings. The town's residents moved with unhurried purpose, their faces bearing the weathered look of those who lived in harmony with the sea's moods. He parked outside the cathedral just as another flash of lightning illuminated its Gothic spires. The building seemed to pulse with its own energy, its stained glass windows glowing from within despite the gathering darkness. As Sip stepped out of his car, he noticed a young man watching him from the cathedral steps. Callisto Calfrost's strange amber eyes seemed to peer straight through Sip's expensive suit and carefully maintained facade. The former street artist's face bore intricate scars that resembled ancient symbols, though no one knew their origin. Cal said nothing, but his presence made Sip unexpectedly uneasy. Inside, the cathedral was a study in contrasts. Modern heating vents had been discreetly worked into centuries-old stone walls, and solar-powered lights illuminated medieval frescoes. The air was heavy with incense and the whispered prayers of the faithful who had already gathered. Father Lysander Vale stood at the altar, his tall frame silhouetted against the enormous rose window behind him. Unlike many priests, he wore his gray hair in a long braid down his back, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much suffering during his humanitarian work in war zones. Something about his calm presence made Sipes' carefully prepared challenge feel suddenly childish. As the last parishioners filed in, Sister Celeste Ambrose hurried down a side aisle, her modern navy habit swishing quietly against the stone floor. She paused briefly near Sip, and her milk-white eyes widened in what looked like recognition, though they had never met. She whispered something in an ancient language before hurrying away, leaving behind the scent of sea salt and herbs. The storm outside intensified, rain drumming against the cathedral's walls like impatient fingers. Sip felt the weight of the small device in his pocket, a quantum sensor of his own design, meant to detect and measure any anomalies that might be mistaken for divine intervention. He had come armed with science, ready to expose faith as nothing more than a comfortable delusion. As Father Lysander raised his hands to begin the Mass, Sip rose from his seat, his voice cutting through the reverent silence like a blade. What happened next would change not only his life, but the very fabric of reality in Meridian Cove forever. Cyprian Thorne's voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling of St. Lysander's Cathedral, each word precise and cutting like a surgeon's scalpel. "Father Vale, before you begin your rituals, I have something to say." The congregation turned in their pews, a collective gasp rippling through the ancient stone walls. Father Lysander lowered his hands slowly, his weathered face betraying no surprise, as if he had been expecting this interruption. His deep-set eyes, which had witnessed countless horrors in war-torn countries, fixed on Sip with an unsettling calm. "Speak then, Mr. Thorne. We've been expecting you." The simple statement caught Sip off guard. He had told no one of his plans. Recovering quickly, he stepped into the central aisle, the heels of his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone floor. The quantum sensor in his pocket hummed quietly, already collecting baseline readings of the cathedral's electromagnetic field. "I've spent 20 years developing algorithms that can predict particle behavior with perfect accuracy," Sipe announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "My quantum computers have mapped consciousness itself, and do you know what they've never found? Any evidence of divine intervention. Not a single trace of your God in the mathematical fabric of reality." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the stained glass windows in brilliant colors that danced across the congregation's faces. Sister Celeste Ambrose, seated in the front row, began quietly murmuring what sounded like a prayer in an ancient language, her milk-white eyes fixed on something no one else could see. "I've come here tonight because your cathedral claims to be different," Sip continued, pulling out his quantum sensor and holding it up. "You claim miracles happen within these walls, unexplainable healings, visions, prophecies. Well, I'm here to prove it's all elaborate manipulation. Every miracle has a scientific explanation, and I'm going to expose it." Cal Frost moved silently from his position by the door, circling the edge of the congregation like a shadow. His amber eyes never left Sip, and the scars on his face seemed to shift in the strange light. The young man's presence made the hair on the back of Sip's neck stand up, but he pressed on. "My son, Marcus, was only 8 when cancer took him." Sip's voice cracked slightly, but he forced himself to continue. "I spent every night in this very cathedral praying to your God. I offered everything I had, my wealth, my life, anything to save him. But there was no answer. Just silence. And do you know why?" He turned to address the congregation directly. "Because there's nothing to answer. It's all an elaborate fiction we've created to comfort ourselves in the face of a cold, uncaring universe." Father Lysander descended the altar steps with deliberate grace. His long gray braid swayed gently as he moved, and despite Sip's hostile stance, the priest's face showed only compassion. "You speak of algorithms and quantum mechanics, Mr. Thorne. But have you considered that science and faith might be two languages describing the same reality?" "Spare me your metaphysical nonsense," Sip scoffed, though something in the priest's calm demeanor unsettled him. "I challenge your God to prove his existence, right here, right now. Let him show himself in a way my instruments can measure, my computers can verify." The quantum sensor in his hand suddenly emitted a high-pitched whine, its readings spiking inexplicably. Sipe frowned, tapping the device's screen. "Impossible," he muttered, watching as complex patterns formed in the data stream, patterns that shouldn't exist in normal spacetime. Sister Celeste's voice rose above the murmuring congregation. "The veil grows thin tonight. They gather to witness." Her milk-white eyes seemed to glow in the cathedral's dim light, and several parishioners crossed themselves nervously. "Who gathers?" Sipe demanded, trying to maintain his composure as the quantum sensor continued to produce impossible readings. "What are you playing at?" Father Lysander stepped closer, his voice gentle, but carrying an undertone of power that filled the cathedral. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "You seek proof through instruments, Mr. Thorne, but some truths can only be measured by the heart. You're not the first to demand evidence of the divine, nor will you be the last. But consider this. What if the very mathematics you trust so completely is itself a glimpse of divine order?" Cal Frost had completed his circuit of the cathedral, and now stood directly behind Sip. "The symbols know you," he said softly, his first words of the evening. "They've been waiting." Sipe spun around, unnerved by the young man's proximity. The scars on Cal's face seemed to be moving, rearranging themselves into patterns that matched the impossible data on the quantum sensor's screen. "This is some kind of trick," Sip insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "No tricks, Mr. Thorne," Father Lysander replied. "Only truth, showing itself in a language you might understand. Look at your sensor again." The device was now displaying a sequence of numbers that made Sip's blood run cold. It was the exact date and time of his son's death, followed by a series of quantum coordinates that, according to all known laws of physics, shouldn't exist in our universe. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, but inside the cathedral, a strange calm had descended. The air felt thick with potential, as if reality itself was holding its breath. Sister Celeste rose from her seat, her white eyes fixed on Sip. "The price of proof," she whispered, "is often higher than we expect to pay. Are you prepared for what you might find, Cyprian Thorne?" The quantum sensor suddenly grew hot in Sip's hand, its screen flickering with symbols that looked remarkably like the scars on Cal's face. And in that moment, as lightning transformed the stained glass windows into kaleidoscopes of impossible light, Cyprian Thorne realized he might have opened a door that couldn't easily be closed. The quantum sensor slipped from Cyprian's trembling fingers, clattering against the cathedral's stone floor with a sound that echoed like thunder. The device's screen continued to pulse with impossible data, casting an eerie blue glow that danced across the worried faces of the congregation. But it was what Sip saw beyond the device that made his carefully constructed worldview begin to crack. The space around Father Lysander seemed to bend and ripple, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The priest's long gray braid moved as if underwater, though there was no breeze inside the cathedral. Most disturbing of all, the quantum readings suggested that the space Father Lysander occupied existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, something that should have been mathematically impossible. "What kind of technology are you using?" Sipe demanded, his voice shakier than he would have liked. "What's causing these readings?" He reached for his phone, desperate to document what he was seeing, but the screen remained black despite his frantic attempts to turn it on. Sister Celeste Ambrose rose from her seat, her white robes seeming to absorb and reflect the strange light in ways that defied physics. "Technology?" she asked, her milk-white eyes somehow both blind and all-seeing. "No, Mr. Thorne. What you're witnessing is far older than your machines. The veil between worlds has always been thinnest here in Meridian Cove, where the ancient cliffs meet the eternal sea." Cal Frost moved silently to retrieve the fallen sensor, his scarred face reflecting patterns that matched the device's impossible readings. "The symbols speak to those who listen," he said, his amber eyes fixed on Sip. "They've been trying to reach you since you arrived, but your mind was too closed to hear them." Sipe backed away, his expensive shoes scuffing against the worn stone floor. "This is absurd. There must be a logical explanation. Perhaps electromagnetic interference from the storm, or—" His voice trailed off as he noticed that the stained glass windows no longer showed the raging tempest outside. Instead, they displayed scenes that seemed to move and change, not like videos or projections, but like windows into other times and places. Father Lysander stepped forward, and the air around him continued to ripple with that strange dimensional distortion. "You came seeking proof, Cyprian Thorne. But are you prepared to accept it if it doesn't fit your preconceptions? Sometimes the truth is far stranger than our carefully constructed theories about reality. A haunting melody began to fill the cathedral. Though none of the congregants were singing, it seemed to emerge from the stones themselves, a harmony of voices in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. The quantum sensor in Cal's hands began to spin in the air, defying gravity as it mapped patterns of energy that shouldn't have existed in normal spacetime. "Stop this," Sip whispered. Then louder, "Stop this!" His voice cracked with a mixture of fear and anger. "Whatever game you're playing, whatever technology you're using to create these illusions—" "Illusions?" Sister Celeste interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. "Like the illusion of control you've built your life around? The comfort you find in reducing the infinite to finite equations?" The temperature in the cathedral dropped suddenly, and Sip's breath became visible in the air. The strange light playing across the walls began to coalesce into shapes, figures that moved with purpose but defied description. His scientific mind struggled to categorize what he was seeing, but every attempt at rational explanation crumbled in the face of what was unfolding before him. "Your son," Father Lysander said softly, and Sip's heart nearly stopped. "Marcus. He tried to reach you, you know, in those moments between life and death when the veil was thinnest. But your grief was so locked in anger, so trapped in the need for logical explanation, that you couldn't hear him." Sip's knees weakened, and he grabbed a nearby pew for support. How do you know his name? I never told anyone here about Marcus." Cal stepped closer, the scars on his face now clearly forming equations, the same quantum formulas Sip had used in his groundbreaking research. "The symbols remember everything, Mr. Thorne. They remember your prayers, your tears, your rage. They remember the night you turned your back on hope itself." The quantum sensor suddenly projected a holographic image into the air, but unlike any hologram Sip had ever seen, this one seemed to have depth and substance that reached into dimensions his instruments shouldn't have been able to detect. Within the projection, he saw himself 20 years younger, kneeling at an altar much like this one, his hands gripping the railing so hard his knuckles had turned white. "That's enough," Sip said, but his voice held more plea than command. The weight of memory threatened to crush him. "You've made your point. You have technology I don't understand, capabilities I haven't encountered before. But that doesn't prove—" "Look deeper," Sister Celeste commanded, her white eyes now seeming to emit their own light. "Look past the equations and algorithms you've hidden behind. Look with your heart, Cyprian Thorne, before it's too late." The holographic image shifted, and Sip found himself staring at something that shattered the last remnants of his rational defenses. There, in the quantum light, was Marcus. Not as he had been in his final days, weak and pale in a hospital bed, but as he might have been had he lived. A young man with his father's sharp features and his mother's gentle eyes, reaching out across the barrier between what was and what might have been. And in that moment, as the impossible light filled St. Lysander's Cathedral and the ancient stones hummed with otherworldly energy, Cyprian Thorne began to understand that he had stumbled upon something far more profound than proof. He had found the first crack in the wall he'd built, between himself and the greatest mystery of all. The holographic image of Marcus hung in the air like a ghost made of quantum light, each detail so perfect it made Sip's chest ache. He could see the slight crook in his son's smile, the same one that had appeared whenever he was about to share a secret. It was a detail so intimate, so precisely rendered, that it transcended any possibility of technological trickery. "This is cruel," Sip managed, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Using my son's image, manipulating my grief." He tried to summon his earlier anger, to rebuild the walls of logic and reason that had protected him for 20 years, but they crumbled like sand against the tide of what he was witnessing. Father Lysander moved with that strange, fluid grace that seemed to bend space around him. "We aren't manipulating anything, Mr. Thorne. The barriers between worlds are more permeable than your science has yet discovered. What you're seeing is real as the quantum particles you've spent your life studying." The cathedral's interior had transformed into something that defied conventional physics. The walls appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched the pulse of the quantum sensor's readings. Ancient symbols, similar to those scarred into Cal's face, began to appear and disappear on the stone surfaces, each one corresponding to a specific quantum equation. "Impossible," Sip whispered, but the word had lost its certainty. He watched as his own equations, the mathematical proofs he'd used to deny the existence of anything beyond the material world, appeared among the ancient symbols. But here, integrated into this impossible display, they told a different story. They weren't disproving the divine. They were describing it in the language of mathematics. Sister Celeste approached, her white robes now seeming to exist in multiple states simultaneously, like quantum particles before observation collapses their wave function. "You've been looking at only part of the equation, Mr. Thorne. Your mathematics wasn't wrong. It was incomplete. The universe is far stranger than our limited minds can comprehend." Cal Frost raised his hands, and the scars on his face began to glow with an inner light. The quantum sensor responded, its readings aligning with the patterns on his skin. "The ancients understood," he said softly. "They didn't have our technology, but they knew. These symbols aren't just scars, Mr. Thorne. They're equations written in the language of creation itself." The holographic image of Marcus shifted, and suddenly the cathedral was filled with multiple versions of Sip's son, each one representing a different possibility, a different path his life might have taken. In one, he was a musician, fingers dancing across piano keys. In another, he wore a lab coat, examining complex molecular structures. In yet another, he stood in a pulpit very much like Father Lysander's. "Quantum superposition," Sip breathed, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Multiple states existing simultaneously until observation collapses them into a single reality. But that's supposed to only work at the quantum level, not with human souls? Father Lysander finished gently. "The boundaries between quantum and cosmic are not as fixed as we once believed. Your son exists, Mr. Thorne. Not in the way you wanted, not in this particular reality, but he exists. All possibilities exist, suspended in the infinite mind of God." The quantum sensor's readings suddenly spiked, and the device began to spin faster, creating a vortex of light and data. The temperature in the cathedral dropped further, and Sip could see his breath forming complex fractal patterns in the air, patterns that matched both the ancient symbols and his own quantum equations. "Your grief is real," Sister Celeste said, her blind eyes somehow managing to lock onto Sipes. "Your pain is real. But your conclusion, that the absence of answer meant the absence of God, was flawed. Sometimes the answer is simply beyond our current ability to comprehend." The multiple versions of Marcus began to fade, but before they disappeared completely, one of them turned to Sipe and spoke. The voice was exactly as he remembered it, with that slight lisp his son had never quite outgrown. "Dad," the figure said, "I tried to tell you. In those last moments, when the veil was thinnest, I tried to tell you that it wasn't the end." Sip reached out instinctively, his hand passing through the quantum light, but instead of encountering empty air, he felt something, a sensation beyond physical touch, like the mathematical concept of infinity made tangible. In that moment, all his carefully constructed arguments about the impossibility of the divine seemed as insubstantial as shadows. The congregation had remained silent throughout this display, but now a low hum began to build as they started to pray. The sound matched the resonant frequency of the quantum sensor exactly, creating standing waves of energy that made the very air shimmer with possibility. "You wanted proof," Father Lysander said quietly. "But perhaps what you're being offered is something far more valuable, the understanding that proof itself is limited by our capacity to comprehend it. Some truths can only be approached through the heart, even as they manifest in the language of mathematics you hold so dear." Cyprian Thorne, the man who had built an empire on the certainty of numbers, found himself standing at the edge of a mystery far deeper than he had ever imagined. and as the quantum lights danced around him, and the ancient stones of St. Lysander's Cathedral pulsed with otherworldly energy, he began to understand that perhaps his greatest mistake hadn't been in seeking proof, but in believing that proof alone could encompass the full magnitude of existence. The quantum light slowly faded, leaving Sip standing in a cathedral that seemed both familiar and profoundly changed. The stone walls still held their ancient strength, but now he could see, or perhaps sense, the complex mathematical patterns that flowed through them like blood through veins. His entire perception of reality had shifted, as if someone had suddenly added a new dimension to his vision. "I don't," he started, then stopped, his usually precise mind struggling to form coherent thoughts. The quantum sensor lay quiet now in Cal's hands, but its screen continued to display readings that should have been impossible, patterns that perfectly merged Sip's advanced equations with the ancient symbols carved into the young man's face. Father Lysander approached slowly, his movement still carrying that strange quality of existing in multiple spaces simultaneously. "Your son's message wasn't the end, Mr. Thorne. It was just the beginning. There's more you need to see, if you're willing to look beyond the walls you've built." Sister Celeste moved to the altar, her white robes seeming to gather shadows and light in equal measure. "The proof you sought was always here, hidden in plain sight. Your own work proved it, though you refused to see the implications. Show him, Callisto." Cal stepped forward, the scars on his face pulsing gently in the cathedral's dim light. He held out the quantum sensor, its screen now displaying a familiar sequence, the core equation that had made Sip's fortune, the mathematical proof that had revolutionized quantum computing. "Look carefully," Cal said softly. "Look at what you actually discovered, not what you thought you proved." Sip stared at the equation, seeing it with new eyes. The elegant mathematical expression that he had used to model quantum consciousness suddenly seemed to tell a different story. Where he had seen proof of consciousness as merely an emergent property of complex systems, he now saw something else, a window into something far more profound. "The pattern," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not random. It's not just complexity emerging from chaos. It's... He couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too overwhelming to voice. "It's a signature," Father Lysander completed for him, "written into the very fabric of reality. Your equation didn't disprove God, Mr. Thorne. It proved that consciousness itself is fundamental to the universe, not an accident of evolution, but an essential component of existence." The air in the cathedral grew heavy with presence, and Sip watched in amazement as his equation seemed to lift off the sensor's screen, expanding and rotating in the air. As it turned, he could see how it aligned perfectly with the ancient symbols on the walls, with the scars on Cal's face, with patterns he now realized he had been seeing his entire life but had dismissed as coincidence. "Your grief blinded you," Sister Celeste said, her white eyes reflecting the ghostly light of the floating equations. "In your pain, you saw only what you expected to see. But now look again. Look at what your life's work actually revealed." The equation continued to expand, incorporating new dimensions that Sip's mathematics had only hinted at. He saw how his proof of quantum consciousness connected to the very structure of space-time, how it described not just the mechanics of thought, but the fundamental nature of being itself. "All these years," he said, his voice barely audible, "I thought I was disproving the divine, but I was actually mapping it. Every breakthrough, every discovery. I was creating a map of God's fingerprints," Father Lysander finished. "Written in the language you could understand best, mathematics. Your quest for proof wasn't wrong, Cyprian. You were simply reading the evidence backward." The congregation remained eerily still, their combined presence creating a tangible field of energy that Sip could now perceive as clearly as he could see light or feel heat. He realized that what he had dismissed as mass hysteria or group psychology was actually something far more profound, a quantum entanglement of consciousness itself. Cal held up the quantum sensor once more, its readings now showing something that made Sipe's scientific mind reel. The device was detecting patterns of energy that matched precisely with ancient religious texts' descriptions of divine presence, patterns that could be expressed perfectly in the mathematical language he had spent his life developing. "Your son knew," Sister Celeste said gently. In those final moments when his consciousness was expanding beyond the physical, he understood what you had actually discovered. He tried to tell you, but you weren't ready to hear it. The weight of understanding nearly brought Sip to his knees. 20 years of certainty crumbled as he realized that his life's work, his attempt to disprove the divine, had actually created the most elegant proof of its existence. His mathematics hadn't eliminated God from the equation. It had revealed how deeply the divine was woven into the very structure of reality. "All this time," he whispered, tears flowing freely now, "I thought I was working against. But I was actually working toward." He couldn't finish the sentence, but Father Lysander nodded in understanding. "The path of the scientist and the path of the mystic lead to the same summit," the priest said. "They simply use different maps for the journey. Your map, Mr. Thorne, was written in quantum equations, but it brought you here just the same." The cathedral seemed to pulse with this new understanding, its ancient stones resonating with frequencies that matched precisely with Sipe's quantum calculations. He had come seeking to challenge God, only to find that his entire life's work had been a testament to divine intelligence, hidden in the elegant mathematics of existence itself. Despite the overwhelming evidence before him, something deep within Cyprian Thorne rebelled. 20 years of rigid scientific thinking and carefully constructed walls couldn't crumble in a single evening, no matter how extraordinary the revelations. A familiar anger began to rise, mixing with his confusion and fear. "This could all be an elaborate hoax," he said, his voice gaining strength as he retreated to the familiar territory of skepticism. "Advanced holographic technology, quantum field manipulators, even psychotropic compounds in the incense. There are countless ways to create convincing illusions." Father Lysander watched him with quiet compassion, the dimensional distortions around his form becoming more pronounced as Sipe's resistance grew. "Even now, you seek refuge in denial. But tell me, Mr. Thorne, what technology could replicate the quantum signature of your son's consciousness? What illusion could match the mathematical patterns you yourself discovered?" The quantum sensor in Cal's hands began to emit a low, pulsing tone that matched the frequency of Sip's heightened heartbeat. The scars on Cal's face shifted again, forming new equations that described exactly what was happening in Sip's brain at that moment. The neural patterns of a mind fighting against paradigm-shattering truth. "You're manipulating me," Sipe accused, though his voice lacked conviction. "Using my grief, my guilt about Marcus to—" He stopped abruptly as the quantum sensor projected another image, but this one was different from the others. It showed a scene he had never shared with anyone, a private moment he had locked away in the deepest corners of his memory. In the projection, a younger Sipe sat in his private lab late at night, surrounded by computers running his quantum consciousness simulations. On one screen, a pattern emerged that made him pause. A perfect mathematical description of what religious texts called the soul. For a brief moment, his equations had captured something transcendent, something that hinted at consciousness surviving beyond physical death. But in his grief-driven determination to disprove faith, he had deleted the data, convinced it must have been an error. "How?" Sipe whispered, staring at the projected scene. "That's impossible. No one knew about that night. I never told anyone. Never recorded it anywhere." Sister Celeste moved closer, her blind eyes somehow seeing straight through his defenses. "The truth leaves traces, Mr. Thorne. Like quantum entanglement, some connections cannot be severed, even by our most determined attempts to deny them." The air in the cathedral grew thicker, charged with a presence that Sip's instruments could measure, but his mind still refused to fully accept. The ancient stones seemed to vibrate with frequencies that matched exactly the error he had deleted all those years ago. "Your resistance is natural," Father Lysander said softly. "Fear often masquerades as skepticism. But consider this. What if your life's work wasn't meant to disprove faith, but to translate it into a language your scientific mind could understand? Cal stepped forward, the equations on his face now moving with increased urgency. "The symbols know your fear," he said. "They've carried the weight of human doubt for millennia, but they also know what you discovered that night, what you've been running from ever since." The quantum sensor's readings suddenly aligned with the deleted data from that long-ago night, creating a perfect harmony of past and present. The mathematical proof of consciousness surviving death hung in the air between them, undeniable in its elegant simplicity. "Stop," Sip demanded, but his voice cracked. "Just stop." He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to hold on to his carefully constructed worldview as it continued to unravel. The evidence before him was becoming harder to deny, yet his mind frantically searched for rational explanations. The congregation remained silent, their combined presence creating a field of consciousness that the quantum sensor measured in patterns identical to those Sip had discovered and deleted. Each reading, each measurement, each piece of data pointed to the same impossible conclusion: that consciousness was not bounded by physical reality, that what religions called the soul had a quantum signature that persisted beyond bodily death. "Your equations were perfect," Sister Celeste said, her voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "They described exactly what saints and mystics have been trying to tell us for thousands of years. You simply refused to accept their implications." Lightning flashed outside, but the storm seemed distant now, separated from the cathedral by layers of reality that Sip was only beginning to perceive. The quantum sensor continued its impossible readings, each one matching perfectly with both ancient religious texts and his own advanced mathematics. "I've spent my entire life," Sip said quietly, "building walls of logic and reason, creating proofs and equations to show that everything can be explained through science. If what you're showing me is true, then everything I've believed, everything I've taught, is still valid," Father Lysander interrupted gently. "Science isn't wrong, Mr. Thorne. It's just incomplete. Your equations didn't fail to describe reality. They described a reality far more vast and mysterious than you were willing to accept." The weight of understanding pressed down on Sip like a physical force. He found himself caught between worlds, the familiar territory of pure mathematics and the unexplored realm of quantum spirituality that his own work had inadvertently mapped. His resistance began to feel less like scientific skepticism and more like fear of what acceptance might mean. As Cyprian Thorne struggled with his internal battle, the cathedral itself seemed to respond. The ancient stones pulsed with a deep, resonant frequency that matched exactly the quantum harmonics his research had predicted but never detected. The air grew thick with possibility, and the space between moments seemed to stretch like elastic. "Perhaps," Father Lysander said softly, "it's time to show you something beyond mathematical proofs." He nodded to Cal, who stepped forward with the quantum sensor held before him like an offering. "Sometimes, Mr. Thorne, the most profound truths must be experienced rather than calculated." The sensor's reading suddenly spiked, its screen displaying patterns so complex they seemed to fold in on themselves. The temperature in the cathedral dropped sharply, and Sip watched in astonishment as his breath formed fractals in the air. Perfect mathematical expressions of infinity made visible. Sister Celeste raised her hands, her milk-white eyes now gleaming with an inner light that defied physical explanation. "The veil parts," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "They gather to witness." The air around Sip began to shimmer, and he felt a sensation like static electricity crawling across his skin. The quantum sensor's readings went beyond anything he had ever recorded, showing energy patterns that suggested the overlap of multiple dimensions, exactly as his theoretical models had predicted but which he had dismissed as impossible. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and scientific curiosity. The equations floating in the air around him began to move faster, merging and separating in patterns that matched the ancient symbols on the cathedral walls. "Watch," Cal commanded, his scarred face now glowing with an inner light that perfectly matched the quantum frequencies being detected. The sensor in his hands began to spin, creating a vortex of data and energy that spread outward in concentric circles. The congregation's silent prayers seemed to take on physical form, waves of consciousness that the sensor detected and measured in perfect mathematical harmony. Each prayer created ripples in the quantum field, forming patterns that matched exactly with the theoretical models SIAP had developed for consciousness itself. Suddenly, the space in the center of the cathedral began to fold in ways that shouldn't have been possible in three-dimensional space. The quantum sensor's readings showed what SIP's equations had only hinted at, the actual mechanics of reality shifting to accommodate something that existed beyond normal space-time. "Your equations predicted this," Father Lysander said quietly, his form seeming to exist in multiple states simultaneously. "In your quest to disprove the divine, you actually mapped its architecture. Watch now as theory becomes experience." The folded space began to glow with a light that had no physical source. Within it, shapes and patterns emerged that corresponded exactly with SIP's most advanced quantum consciousness models. But instead of the cold, mechanical processes he had expected, he saw something alive, aware, and infinitely complex. "This is..." SIP struggled to find words as his scientific mind tried to process what he was witnessing. "This is impossible. The energy requirements alone would..." "Energy?" Sister Celeste's voice carried a hint of amusement. "You're still thinking in terms of physical limitations, Mr. Thorne. But what you're seeing exists beyond those constraints. Your own equations proved it was possible. You just refused to accept the implications." The quantum sensor's readings now showed something that made SIP's breath catch in his throat. The energy patterns matched exactly with his theories about consciousness surviving death, but they were far more complex, far more organized than he had imagined possible. And within those patterns, he began to recognize something familiar. "Marcus," he whispered, as the quantum frequencies aligned in a way that was unmistakably similar to his son's neural patterns, patterns he had mapped and studied endlessly in his grief-driven research. The light within the folded space pulsed in response, and the quantum sensor displayed confirmation. The consciousness patterns it was detecting matched perfectly with the quantum signatures SIP had recorded from his son's brain activity during those final days in the hospital. "Your work wasn't wrong," Cal said softly, the equations on his face moving in sync with the sensor's readings. "Your mathematics perfectly describe the quantum nature of consciousness. You just stopped short of following the evidence to its ultimate conclusion." The air around them crackled with energy, as multiple realities seemed to intersect in the sacred space of the cathedral. The quantum sensor's readings showed what SIP had always dismissed as theoretical, consciousness existing independent of physical structure, maintaining coherence even beyond bodily death. "The patterns," SIP said, his voice trembling as he watched the quantum data stream across the sensor's screen. "They're not random. They're not degrading. They're stable, self-organizing. That's not possible unless consciousness itself is fundamental to reality," Father Lysander finished. "Unless what we call the soul has a quantum signature that persists beyond physical death." "Your own equations proved it, Mr. Thorne. You just weren't ready to accept what they were telling you." The cathedral seemed to pulse with this revelation, its ancient stones resonating with frequencies that matched exactly the quantum harmonics being detected. SIP stood at the center of it all, watching as his life's work transformed from what he thought was proof against faith into evidence of something far more profound. In that moment, as multiple realities intersected and quantum consciousness made itself visible, Cyprian Thorne faced a choice that would define not just his future, but his understanding of everything he had ever believed to be true. The quantum vortex continued to swirl in the cathedral's center, its patterns growing more complex with each passing moment. Cyprian Thorne stood frozen, watching as his life's work revealed truths he had spent decades denying. The sensor's readings were undeniable, yet his mind still fought against their implications. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No." His voice echoed through the cathedral, carrying harmonics that the quantum sensor immediately mapped. "This isn't." This can't be. His carefully constructed worldview was crumbling, and with it, the walls he had built to contain his grief. Father Lysander moved closer, the dimensional distortions around him intensifying. What frightens you more, Mr. Thorne? That your equations might be wrong or that they might be right in ways you never imagined? The quantum sensor suddenly emitted a high-pitched tone, and the air around Sipe began to crystallize with mathematical patterns, his own equations made visible in the fabric of reality. But instead of the cold, mechanical universe he had believed in, these equations showed something alive, aware, and infinitely complex. "Everything I've built," Sipe said, his voice breaking, "my whole career, my reputation, it's all based on disproving this. If what you're showing me is true, then I've been wrong about everything. Not just the science, but..." He couldn't finish the sentence, the weight of implication too heavy to voice. Sister Celeste's blind eyes seemed to see straight through him. Wrong? Or perhaps you were right in ways you didn't understand. Your equations didn't disprove the divine, Mr. Thorne. They proved it exists in ways more profound than anyone had imagined. The air grew thick with quantum possibility as multiple realities seemed to overlap. Cal stood silent, the scars on his face pulsing with patterns that matched the sensor's increasingly complex readings. Each pattern seemed to tell a story, not just of mathematics and physics, but of loss, love, and the persistent nature of consciousness itself. "I can't." Sip stumbled backward, overwhelmed by the implications. If this is real, if consciousness really does persist beyond death, if Marcus... His voice caught on his son's name. "All these years, I've been telling people there's nothing after death, that consciousness just ends, that their loved ones are just... gone." The quantum vortex pulsed, and within it, images began to form. Faces of people who had read Sipe's books, attended his lectures, believed his proofs that consciousness was nothing more than neural activity that ceased with death. He saw their grief, their loss of hope, their struggle to find meaning in a universe he had told them was cold and meaningless. "The weight of influence carries its own responsibility," Father Lysander said quietly. "But truth has a way of emerging, even when we try to deny it. Your work wasn't wrong, Mr. Thorne. It was incomplete." The sensor's readings suddenly shifted, showing something that made Sip's scientific mind reel. The quantum patterns of consciousness it was detecting weren't just persisting. They were evolving, growing more complex, interacting with other patterns in ways his equations had predicted, but which he had dismissed as theoretical impossibilities. "Marcus," he whispered, watching as his son's quantum signature appeared in the data stream. "All this time, you were trying to tell me. In those final moments, when you said you could see something beautiful waiting." Tears streamed down his face as 2 decades of buried memory surfaced. Sister Celeste moved forward, her white robes seeming to gather and reflect the quantum light. "Your son's last words weren't delusions, Mr. Thorne. He was seeing reality as it truly is, not bound by physical limitations, but infinite in its possibilities." The cathedral stones began to hum with a deep resonance that matched exactly the frequency of human consciousness, as measured by Sipe's own instruments. The quantum sensor displayed reading after reading, each one confirming what he had spent his life denying: that consciousness was not an emergent property of brain activity, but a fundamental aspect of reality itself. "My whole life," Sipe said, his voice barely audible, "I thought I was pursuing truth, but I was really running from it. Running from the implications of my own discoveries. Running from..." He looked up at the quantum vortex where his son's consciousness pattern continued to pulse with undeniable clarity. Cal stepped forward, the equations on his face now moving with urgent intensity. "The symbols have been waiting for this moment, Mr. Thorne. The moment when your mathematics and ancient wisdom finally align. The question is, are you ready to accept what they're showing you?" The crisis point had arrived. Cyprian Thorne, the man who had built his reputation on denying the possibility of spiritual reality, stood in the center of undeniable proof, His own equations, his life's work, had revealed exactly what he had set out to disprove. The choice he made next would determine not just his future, but his understanding of everything he had ever believed to be true. In the quantum-charged atmosphere of St. Lysander's Cathedral, Cyprian Thorne faced the moment of truth that would define the rest of his existence. The sensors continued their impossible readings, each new data point further confirming what he had spent decades denying. The air itself seemed to vibrate with potential, waiting for his decision. "I've built my entire identity," he said, his voice trembling, "on being the man who proved there was nothing beyond physical reality, the scientist who showed that consciousness ends with death. If I accept this, if I acknowledge what these readings are showing..." He paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. Father Lysander stepped forward, the dimensional distortions around him creating patterns that matched perfectly with Sipes' quantum equations. "Sometimes, Mr. Thorne, the greatest act of scientific integrity is admitting when new evidence challenges our most cherished beliefs." The quantum sensor in Cal's hands suddenly projected a new series of equations into the air, Sipes' own mathematical proofs, but now expanded and completed in ways he had never imagined possible. The ancient symbols on Cal's face shifted to align with these new equations, creating a perfect synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern science. "Look," Sister Celeste commanded, her blind eyes reflecting the quantum light. "Look at what your equations were trying to tell you all along. Each formula, each proof, they weren't disproving the divine. They were mapping its architecture." Sip watched as his life's work transformed before his eyes. The mathematical models he had created to show consciousness as merely an emergent property of brain activity now revealed something far more profound. His equations, when fully expanded, showed consciousness as a fundamental property of the universe itself, exactly as religious traditions had claimed for millennia. Marcus knew, he whispered, understanding flooding through him. In those final moments, when he said he could see both sides of reality at once, he wasn't hallucinating. He was perceiving what my equations had predicted, but what I refused to accept. The quantum vortex pulsed with new intensity, and within it, Sip could see patterns of consciousness that matched his son's neural signatures perfectly. But they weren't degrading or dissipating as his theories had predicted. They were evolving, becoming more complex, integrating with larger patterns of quantum consciousness that pervaded the cathedral space. "Your son's consciousness didn't end, Mr. Thorne," Father Lysander said gently. "It transformed exactly as your mathematics suggested it would. If you had followed the equations to their logical conclusion instead of stopping when they challenged your beliefs." Cal moved forward, the equations on his face now moving with a new urgency. "The symbols show a choice approaching," he said, his amber eyes intense. "A moment when personal truth and universal truth intersect. That moment is now." The quantum sensor's readings suddenly aligned in a way that made Sip's scientific mind reel. The patterns showed consciousness as a quantum field that pervaded all of reality, with individual consciousness as localized expressions of this universal field. His own equations had predicted this exact phenomenon, but he had dismissed it as a mathematical artifact. "All these years," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought I was proving consciousness was nothing but neural activity. But my equations were actually showing that consciousness is everything, the fundamental basis of reality itself, and I was too afraid to see it." Sister Celeste approached, her white robe seeming to gather and reflect the quantum light. "Fear often masks itself as certainty, Mr. Thorne. The need to believe we understand everything can blind us to the greater truths waiting to be discovered." The air in the cathedral grew heavy with potential, as multiple realities seemed to converge on this single moment of choice. The quantum sensor showed pattern after pattern of consciousness, persisting beyond physical death, each one matching perfectly with both ancient religious descriptions and modern quantum theory. "If I accept this," Sipe said slowly, "everything changes. Not just my understanding of reality, but my responsibility to the world. All the people I've influenced, all the ones I convinced that death was the absolute end." Father Lysander nodded, understanding in his eyes. Truth has a way of making itself known, Mr. Thorne. Your work wasn't wrong. It was pointing toward something far more profound than either pure materialism or blind faith, something that unites science and spirituality in ways we're only beginning to understand. The quantum vortex pulsed one final time, and within it, Sip saw something that made his heart stop. It was Marcus, not as a static image or mathematical pattern, but as a conscious presence, aware, evolved, and very much alive in ways that transcended physical existence. The quantum sensor confirmed what his heart was telling him. This was real, measurable, and undeniable. In that moment, standing in the intersection of science and spirit, surrounded by proof that merged mathematical precision with mystical truth, Cyprian Thorne made his choice. The walls of his certainty finally crumbled completely, replaced by something far more profound, the understanding that truth was larger than any single perspective, and that his life's work had been leading him to this moment all along. Tears streamed down Cyprian Thorne's face, but for the first time in 20 years, they weren't tears of grief or anger. The quantum vortex continued its ethereal dance in the cathedral's center, and within its swirling patterns he could see the truth he had been running from all along. "I understand now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The quantum sensor in Cal's hands pulsed in harmony with his words, mapping the exact moment his consciousness shifted from denial to acceptance. "All these years, I thought I was pursuing truth through pure mathematics, but I was really using mathematics to hide from it." Father Lysander moved closer, the dimensional distortions around him now perfectly aligned with the equations floating in the air. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from what we're looking for, but from what we've been trying not to see. The cathedral stones hummed with a deep resonance that matched exactly the frequency of quantum consciousness, as mapped by Sip's original equations. But now he could see what his grief-blinded eyes had missed before. The mathematical patterns weren't random or meaningless. They were a language, a code written into the very fabric of reality. "My son," Sipe said, watching as Marcus's quantum signature pulsed within the vortex. He wasn't just conscious in those final moments, he was expanding, becoming part of something larger, something my equations predicted, but I refused to acknowledge. Sister Celeste's blind eyes seemed to reflect the quantum light as she spoke. "Your mathematics didn't fail you, Mr. Thorne. They were leading you to this understanding all along. Each equation, each formula, they were breadcrumbs on the path to a greater truth." The quantum sensor's readings suddenly shifted, displaying a complex series of patterns that made Sip's scientific mind soar with understanding. His theories about consciousness had been correct, but incomplete. Consciousness wasn't just an emergent property of complex systems, it was the fundamental property from which complexity itself emerged. "Look," Cal said softly, the equations on his face moving in perfect synchronization with the sensor's readings. "The symbols show what your mathematics was trying to tell you. Consciousness doesn't end at death. It transcends the physical limitations we impose on it." As if in response to Cal's words, the quantum vortex expanded, filling the cathedral with patterns of light that matched exactly with Sipe's theoretical models of consciousness evolution. But instead of the chaos he had expected, these patterns showed profound organization, a higher-order structure that his equations had hinted at, but which he had dismissed as impossible. "It's beautiful," Sip breathed, watching as mathematical proof and spiritual truth merged before his eyes. "All this time I thought I was mapping the mechanics of neural activity, but I was actually mapping the architecture of consciousness itself, the underlying structure of what religions call the soul." Father Lysander nodded, his form seeming to exist in multiple states simultaneously. "Science and faith are not enemies, Mr. Thorne. They are different languages describing the same reality. Your equations didn't disprove the divine. They proved it exists in ways more profound than anyone had imagined." The air in the cathedral grew thick with quantum possibility as multiple realities seemed to converge. The sensor's readings showed consciousness patterns interacting across dimensions, creating complex networks of awareness that transcended physical space and time. "I remember now," Sipe said, his voice catching with emotion. In Marcus's final moments, when he said he could see both sides at once, he was describing exactly what my equations predicted about consciousness at the quantum level. He wasn't hallucinating. He was experiencing reality as it truly is. Sister Celeste moved forward, her white robes gathering and reflecting the quantum light. Your son became your greatest teacher, Mr. Thorne. Even in death, he was showing you the truth your mathematics had discovered, but which your heart wasn't ready to accept. The quantum vortex pulsed one final time, and within it, Sipe saw something that transformed his understanding forever. It wasn't just Marcus's consciousness pattern he was seeing. It was the vast network of consciousness that connected all reality. His equations had mapped it perfectly, showing how individual awareness was part of a larger, infinite field of consciousness that religious traditions had always called divine. "My God," he whispered, the words carrying a weight he had never intended them to bear. "My whole life I thought I was proving there was nothing beyond physical reality. But my equations were actually showing that physical reality is just the surface of something far more profound." Cal stepped forward, the ancient symbols on his face now moving with a new clarity. The symbols have been waiting for this moment of understanding, when mathematics and mystery finally merge, showing truth that transcends both. The revelation washed over Cyprian Thorne like a wave, transforming everything he had ever believed about reality, consciousness, and his own life's work. In that moment, standing in the quantum-charged atmosphere of St. Lysander's Cathedral, he finally understood that his search for proof hadn't led him away from truth. It had been leading him toward it all along. The revelation that had transformed Cyprian Thorne radiated outward through St. Lysander's Cathedral like ripples in a quantum pool. The congregation, which had remained silently witnessing his journey, began to stir as the atmosphere shifted. The quantum sensor's readings showed something remarkable. Their collective consciousness was creating harmonics that matched perfectly with SIP's equations about unified fields of awareness. "They feel it too," Father Lysander observed, watching as the quantum patterns of individual consciousness began to synchronize throughout the cathedral. "Your understanding is affecting more than just yourself, Mr. Thorne. Truth, once recognized, has a way of spreading." Sister Celeste moved among the congregation, her white robes seeming to gather and reflect the quantum light that now filled the space. "Watch," she said, her blind eyes seeing far more than physical reality. "Watch how understanding transforms not just the individual, but the collective." The quantum sensor in Cal's hands displayed an extraordinary phenomenon. Consciousness patterns throughout the cathedral were aligning, creating a field of shared awareness that transcended individual perception. The ancient symbols on his face pulsed in harmony with these readings, telling a story of transformation that bridged millennia. "I never considered," Sipe said, watching the patterns unfold, "that my work could have this kind of impact. I thought I was just proving a scientific point about consciousness, but..." He trailed off as he realized the full implications of what he was seeing. Father Lysander nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your equations weren't just describing reality, Mr. Thorne. They were providing a bridge between scientific understanding and spiritual truth. A way for people to comprehend the infinite through the language of mathematics." The air in the cathedral hummed with potential, as individuals in the congregation began to share their own experiences. An elderly woman stood, her voice trembling with emotion, as she described seeing her late husband in dreams. Dreams that, according to the quantum sensor's readings, carried the exact frequency signatures of consciousness surviving death. A young man spoke next, describing patterns he'd seen in moments of deep meditation, patterns that matched precisely with Sipe's mathematical models of expanded consciousness. One by one, people began to share experiences they had previously kept hidden, afraid they would be dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking. All this time, Sipe realized, watching as the quantum vortex mapped these shared experiences, people have been experiencing exactly what my equations predicted, but because I said it was impossible, they doubted their own perceptions. I made them question their deepest truths. Cal stepped forward, the equations on his face moving with new urgency. "The symbols show a turning point," he said. "Not just for you, but for all who have been waiting for science and spirit to speak the same truth." The quantum sensor's readings suddenly shifted, showing how individual consciousness patterns were not just surviving death, but evolving, growing more complex, more connected. Each pattern matched perfectly with both ancient religious descriptions of spiritual evolution and SIP's own mathematical models. "Your work has prepared people for this understanding," Sister Celeste said, her voice carrying harmonics that the sensor mapped in perfect mathematical precision. "You gave them the language of science. Now you can show them how that language describes the reality they've always known in their hearts." Throughout the cathedral, people began to share stories of lost loved ones, of moments when they felt connected to something larger than themselves. The quantum sensor confirmed what their hearts had told them. These experiences weren't illusions or emotional projections. They were real, measurable interactions with a field of consciousness that transcended physical limitations. "I need to revise everything I've published," Sipe said, his scientific mind already racing with implications. "Not to retract it, but to complete it, to show how the mathematics doesn't disprove spirituality. It proves it in ways more profound than we ever imagined." Father Lysander smiled, the dimensional distortions around him now perfectly aligned with the collective consciousness field filling the cathedral. "Your journey from skeptic to witness may be exactly what others need to bridge their own divide between reason and faith." The quantum vortex pulsed with new intensity as more people shared their stories. Each experience, each moment of connection with something beyond physical reality, created patterns that matched perfectly with Sipe's theoretical models. Science and spirituality were finally speaking the same language, and the impact was transforming not just individual understanding, but collective consciousness itself. "I see now," Sipe said, watching as the mathematics of consciousness danced through the cathedral space. "Why this had to happen here, in this place, with these people. It's not just about individual revelation. It's about showing how truth transforms communities when we stop fighting between science and faith." Sister Celeste nodded, her blind eyes reflecting the quantum light that filled the space. "Each person here carries a piece of the larger truth. Your mathematics gave them a way to understand it. Their experiences give your equations life and meaning beyond pure theory." The cathedral stones hummed with the resonance of shared understanding as the barrier between scientific proof and spiritual experience dissolved. In its place, a new way of seeing reality emerged, one that honored both the precision of mathematics and the mystery of consciousness surviving death. The quantum patterns that filled St. Lysander's Cathedral began to stabilize, transforming from chaotic swirls of possibility into ordered structures that matched both ancient sacred geometry and Sipe's advanced mathematical models. The sensor in Cal's hands showed something remarkable, the merging of scientific precision and spiritual truth into a unified field of understanding. "It's like watching evolution in real time," Sipe said, his scientist's mind marveling at the patterns. "Not biological evolution, but the evolution of consciousness itself. My equations predicted this was possible, but I never imagined." He trailed off, watching as the quantum field responded to his very thoughts. Father Lysander moved through the transformed space, his form now perfectly integrated with the dimensional distortions that had earlier seemed so strange. "This is what integration looks like, Mr. Thorne. Not the denial of science or the abandonment of reason, but the recognition that truth is large enough to encompass both the measurable and the mysterious." The quantum sensor displayed new readings that made Sipe's breath catch. The consciousness patterns weren't just persisting or evolving, they were creating new structures of awareness that transcended individual experience while preserving personal identity. It was exactly what ancient mystics had described, now confirmed by the most advanced quantum mathematics. "The symbols show completion," Cal said, the equations on his face moving in harmony with the sensor's readings. "Not an ending, but a transformation. The beginning of a new way of understanding reality." Sister Celeste walked among the congregation, her white robes now seeming to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Watch how the patterns change," she said, her blind eyes perceiving far more than physical light. See how each individual consciousness maintains its unique signature while participating in something larger. The cathedral space had become a living laboratory where Sipes' theories about quantum consciousness were being demonstrated in real time. Each person present contributed to a field of awareness that the sensor mapped in perfect mathematical precision, showing how individual consciousness could maintain coherence even while expanding beyond physical limitations. "I need to modify my equations," Sip said, his mind racing with new understanding. Not to change them, but to complete them. To show how consciousness doesn't just survive death, it evolves, expands, becomes part of a larger pattern while maintaining individual coherence. The quantum vortex pulsed in response to his words, displaying mathematical proofs that merged seamlessly with ancient spiritual wisdom. The sensor's readings showed how consciousness could exist in multiple states simultaneously, just as quantum particles did, something Sipes' original equations had suggested, but which he had dismissed as theoretical. "Your son's consciousness," Father Lysander said gently, "exists in this expanded state. Not lost or dissolved, but transformed into something more complex, more connected. Your mathematics proved it was possible. Now you can understand what that really means." The air in the cathedral hummed with harmonics that matched exactly the frequency patterns Sipe had detected in his early research. The same patterns he had deleted, convinced they must have been errors. Now he saw them for what they were, evidence of consciousness operating beyond physical constraints. "All these years," he said, watching as the quantum field displayed his son's unique consciousness signature, "I thought I was running from truth, but I was actually running toward it, building the mathematical framework needed to understand what mystics have always known." Sister Celeste nodded, her presence somehow both physical and transcendent. "The universe speaks many languages, Mr. Thorne. Mathematics is one, mysticism is another. When we stop fighting between them, we begin to hear the full symphony of truth." The quantum sensor's readings showed how the collective consciousness field in the cathedral had stabilized into a new configuration, one that maintained individual awareness, while facilitating connection to something larger. It was exactly what religious traditions had described as spiritual communion, now mapped with scientific precision. "The integration isn't just theoretical," Cal observed, the ancient symbols on his face moving in perfect synchronization with the quantum patterns. "It's happening within each person here, as they realize they don't have to choose between reason and faith." Sipe watched as his life's work transformed from a weapon against faith into a bridge between worlds. His equations, originally designed to disprove the possibility of consciousness surviving death, now provided the mathematical framework for understanding exactly how it happened. "We need both," he said finally, understanding flooding through him. "The precision of science and the depth of spiritual wisdom. My mathematics wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. Just as faith without understanding is incomplete. We need both to grasp the full reality of what consciousness really is." The cathedral stones resonated with this new understanding, creating harmonics that the quantum sensor mapped in perfect mathematical notation. Science and spirit, reason and faith, physical and transcendent. All were being shown as aspects of a larger truth that could only be understood when artificial divisions were removed. Part 13. New Beginning. The first light of dawn began to filter through the stained glass windows of St. Lysander's Cathedral, transforming the quantum patterns into prismatic displays of mathematical beauty. Cyprian Thorne stood in the changed space, feeling both humbled and expanded by what had transpired through the night. The quantum sensor continued its steady readings, confirming that what had happened was neither illusion nor temporary phenomenon. "So what now?" he asked, looking at Father Lysander. "How does one continue after everything they believed has been transformed?" The question wasn't just rhetorical. The quantum field rippled with his genuine uncertainty about the path ahead. Father Lysander smiled, the dimensional distortions around him now seeming natural, even beautiful. "You walk forward, Mr. Thorne, carrying both your scientific precision and your newfound understanding. The world needs both, perhaps now more than ever." Sister Celeste moved through the morning light, her white robes gathering and reflecting the quantum patterns that still filled the air. "Your journey doesn't end here," she said, her blind eyes seeing far beyond physical reality. "In many ways, it's just beginning." The quantum sensor in Cal's hands displayed complex harmonics as the morning light interacted with the field of consciousness that now permanently permeated the cathedral space. The ancient symbols on his face shifted and flowed, telling stories of transformation and renewal. "The symbols show a new path opening," Cal said, his amber eyes reflecting the dawn light. "Not an ending, but a transformation. Your work will continue, but with deeper purpose now." Sip watched as his equations danced in the morning light, no longer just mathematical abstractions, but living descriptions of how consciousness interconnected with all of reality. "I need to revise my papers," he said thoughtfully. "Not to retract them, but to complete them. To show how quantum consciousness points toward something far more profound than I originally understood." The congregation, which had stayed through the night witnessing this transformation, began to stir. The quantum sensor showed how their individual consciousness patterns had been permanently altered by what they had experienced. Not diminished or overwhelmed, but expanded into new possibilities of awareness. "They'll need guidance," Father Lysander said gently. "Someone who can speak both languages, the precision of science and the wisdom of spirit. Someone who has walked both paths." Sip nodded, understanding the responsibility that came with his transformation. The quantum field responded to his acceptance, showing patterns of possibility spreading outward from this moment, touching countless lives with new understanding. "Marcus would have loved this," he said softly, watching as his son's quantum signature pulsed within the larger field of consciousness. "He always said I was missing something important in my equations. He saw it even then." Sister Celeste smiled, her presence both physical and transcendent. "Your son has been part of this journey all along, Mr. Thorne. His consciousness, evolved and expanded, helped create the conditions for your understanding." The morning sun rose higher, sending shafts of light through the cathedral windows that the quantum sensor showed were far more than just electromagnetic radiation. They carried patterns of consciousness, of awareness, of the infinite mathematical beauty that Sipe had spent his life mapping without recognizing what he was seeing. "The world is ready for this understanding," Cal said, the equations on his face moving with new purpose. "The symbols have been waiting for someone who could translate their wisdom into the language of modern science." Sipe looked around the cathedral, seeing it now with new eyes. The stone walls were more than physical structure. They were waveguides for consciousness itself, their ancient patterns perfectly aligned with quantum field dynamics. Everything his equations had predicted was here, had always been here, waiting to be recognized. "I'll need help," he said, looking at Father Lysander. "This isn't something that should be presented as either pure science or pure spirituality. It needs to be understood as both, simultaneously." Father Lysander nodded, the dimensional distortions around him pulsing with approval. "That's why this happened here in this place with these witnesses. You're not alone in this new beginning, Mr. Thorne." The quantum sensor's readings showed how the night's events had created a permanent change in the fabric of local reality. The barrier between scientific understanding and spiritual truth had been transformed into a bridge, and the effects were spreading outward like ripples in the quantum field. "It's beautiful," Sipe said, watching as his life's work transformed into something far more profound than he had ever imagined. All of it. The mathematics, the mystery, the merger of science and spirit. It's all part of the same truth. As the morning sun filled St. Lysander's Cathedral with new light, Cyprian Thorne stepped forward into his transformed understanding. The quantum fields responded to his movement, showing patterns of possibility that stretched into infinite potential. He had come seeking to challenge God, only to find that his very challenge had led him to a deeper truth than he had ever imagined possible. And in that new dawn, as science and spirit danced together in patterns of quantum beauty, Cyprian Thorne began the next chapter of his journey. Not as a skeptic seeking to disprove, but as a bridge builder helping others understand the profound truth that he had discovered in the merger of mathematics and mystery. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.